I now begin an introduction to Hosea, the prophet who married an immoral woman. As far as authorship goes, there's no good reason to doubt that Hosea essentially wrote the whole book, though you'll get more detail in the textbook. All we know of him biographically is of his marriage to Gomer and his children, described in chapters 1 through 3. Hosea was a prophet of the northern kingdom of Israel. This is during what I call the Silver Age, the first half of the 8th century BC, a time of great economic and political expansion for both Israel and Judah. Assyria arises under Tiglath III to fulfill some of the judgment prophecies that are found here. Outline of the book, first 3 chapters, talks about Israel's covenant violation as dramatized by Hosea's marriage to Gomer. And then chapters 4 through 14, you have Israel's covenant violations illustrated and future hope given. One of the debated issues in Hosea is the nature of his marriage. It seems an unusual thing for a prophet to marry an immoral woman. The book begins the word of the Lord that came to Hosea, the son of Beri, during the reigns of Uzziah, that's first half of the 8th century BC, Jotham, Ahaz, and Hezekiah, kings of Judah, and during the reign of Jeroboam, the son of Jehoash, king of Israel. So that gives you the dates for the book, or the reigns of those kings. First half of the 8th century on into the end of the Silver Age. But then it says in verse 2, when the Lord began to speak through Hosea, the Lord said to him, "Go marry a promiscuous woman and have children with her, for like a adulterous wife, this land is guilty of unfaithfulness to the Lord." Now, what is a godly prophet marrying a promiscuous, immoral woman? And this has troubled commentators, and so they've looked for ways to explain it where it maybe doesn't involve that kind of behavior. One view is that, well, maybe this thing is really just a vision, that Hosea had a vision, and in his vision, the Lord told him to go and marry an immoral woman, a prostitute or the like. And so if that's the case, this is only something happening in the prophet's mind. It did not happen in reality. The problem with this approach, though, is that there is no hint whatsoever in the vision that this is in the prophecy that this is only a visionary experience. A second approach is to say that he married a woman who would prove to be immoral. The older version, the 1984 version of the NIV, actually gave an interpretation along these lines. He was told to marry a adulterous wife, but it probably implies that since a person has to be married to commit adultery, that she would become adulterous only after the marriage. Though in the newer version of the NIV, they have switched that to marry a promiscuous woman, which would be not that same interpretation. Another approach is to say, well, marry a promiscuous woman speaks not of her sexual promiscuity, but rather her worshiping of other gods. In other words, she was spiritually promiscuous. She had violated the covenant between God and Israel by worshiping other gods, just as a wife who commits adultery violates the marriage covenant. And the book of Hosea will build on the marriage analogy with God's covenant with Israel in this book. But I still think that the most likely view is a traditional view. That is, he was to marry a woman who had already proved to be immoral. And not only did she prove to be immoral, but she has already had children. The New King James reads rather literally what the Hebrew text seems to say. Go take yourself a wife of harlotry and children of harlotry, which could suggest that Hosea is actually marrying a woman who has already had children. Now, this word harlotry, the Hebrew word is zanah, that means to commit acts of sexual immorality. You wouldn't necessarily have to be a professional in order to be considered harlotrous. It could just be a loose woman, an immoral woman. Whether or not she's a prostitute or a harlot depends on whether she took money for it or whether she just volunteered it freely. But anyway, I think he married a woman who was already immorally, perhaps even a woman who had already had children. Now, why marriage to an immoral woman seems likely then? Literal reading of the text, take a woman of harlotry and children of harlotry. And two, it was actually not forbidden for prophets to do such a thing. Now, for priests, they were not to marry anyone who had been sexually active. That would include widows. But they were certainly forbidden from marrying anybody who had been promiscuous before marriage. That was not true of priests, of prophets, I should say. And prophets often did unusual things to dramatize their message, as we've already seen, as in the case of Ezekiel and Isaiah. So he marries this woman, and they start having children together. So he bears a child, Jezreel. Jezreel means in Hebrew, God scatters. Or originally it meant God sows. But another sense of sow is to scatter. And it's used here of the scattering of the tribes that's going to take place as a result of God's judgment. And then there's mention in that regard with the blood of Jezreel. So it says in verse 4, the Lord said to Hosea, call him Jezreel, because I will soon punish the house of Jehu for the massacre at Jezreel, and I will put an end to the kingdom of Israel. In that day I will break Israel's bow in the valley of Jezreel. This may be a reference to a bloody revolution that took place when Jehu seized power in 841 BC, in which Jehu killed everybody in sight, the king of Israel, Jezebel, the priests of Baal, but also Ahaziah, the king of Judah, and all the royal offspring that were with him in the battle, and all the princes and aristocrats there. And it may also refer to similar such atrocities of the whole Jehu line. Second child is given the name Lo Ruhamah. She has not been shown compassion. What a name for a kid. What's your name? My name is I'm unloved. Now it could have the sense of no natural affection. Why? Perhaps she was the product of immorality. Maybe it's not even Hosea's child. But she's used to symbolize that God would no longer show compassion in sparing Israel for their sins. And then the third child is named Lo Ami, not my people. Again, this could mean no kin of mine. In other words, this may not be Hosea's child either. And so God would forsake the 10 northern tribes altogether and call them not my people. That's a reversal of the covenant formula. So there's progress in the doom that's here. First of all, Jezreel, God's going to scatter and end the royal house. Scatter Israel and end the royal house. 2, Lo Ruhamah, God's going to show lack of compassion for Israel. And then Lo Ami, God's going to end the relationship with Israel. In chapter 2, the wording seems to have a double meaning. It'll refer to Gomer, but it also refer to Israel. So figuratively to Gomer, literally to the land of Israel. And what's going on here is that Gomer's relationship with Hosea parallels Israel's relationship with God. So that just as Gomer has run away from Hosea and committed adultery, so Israel has run away from God and has committed spiritual adultery by worshiping Baal and other deities. Now, in the midst of all this, there are statements about how God is going to nonetheless reunite the northern tribes with the southern tribes under King Messiah. It says in Hosea 1 and verse 10, "Yet the Israelites will be like the sand on the seashore, which cannot be measured or counted. In the place where it was said to them, 'You are not my people,' they will be called the children of the living God." The people of Israel and the people of Judah and the people of Israel will come together, and they will appoint one leader and will come up out of the land, for great will be the day of Jezreel. And likewise in Hosea 2:23, where after saying that he is going to forsake Israel, he reverses that and says, "I will plant her for myself in the land. I will show my love to the one I called not my loved one." She has not been shown compassion. "And I will say to those called not my people, 'You are my people.' And they will say, 'You are my God.'" And that, of course, raises the question, well, how can this happen? And we'll continue that on the next video.